Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, COVID-19 Vaccines and Food Allergy, What to Know About Vaccines for Children and Teens. I'm Jennifer Gerdts, Executive Director of Food Allergy Canada, and for those of you who are familiar with our organization, you know that we are a registered charity that focuses on providing education and support for those impacted by food allergy and acting as a national voice on key patient issues. In late February, we hosted a webinar on COVID-19 vaccines with a tremendous response from the audience. And at that time, we had 2 approved vaccines and we're in the very early stages of the vaccine rollout. We hosted a second webinar in May with 4 approved vaccines at that time and with 18 million doses having shipped across Canada. And the discussion at that time was around whether one vaccine was better suited than another for those with allergies. Today, the picture is again different, with an approved vaccine for 12 to 17-year-olds, and according to the Government of Canada website, as of July 23rd, 50% of the Canadian population has been fully vaccinated and 70% has received a first dose, and back to school is around the corner. So the focus for today is all about vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines for children and youth with food allergy, addressing your questions around eligibility, safety, efficacy, and later in the talk about the view for the under 12 and panelist perspectives on back to school. To explore these topics, we are fortunate to have experts from Health Canada, infectious disease, and allergy. Before I introduce our panelists, just a couple of housekeeping notes, and we like to start with a poll question to get a sense of where people are at on this topic. So on the housekeeping front, please note that this session is for informational purposes only and will not provide specific individual medical advice. Please talk to your doctor about any specific concerns or questions you may have regarding your own health or your child's health. Secondly, thank you to everyone for submitting their questions on registration. With over 400 questions received, we've synthesized it, and not surprisingly, there are some common themes which we will begin to tackle in today's session. Please feel free to use the chat box if you need clarification on some of the responses, and we would ask that you complete our post-webinar survey to identify unanswered or follow-on questions that may inform additional webinars. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded and shared on foodallergycanada.ca afterwards. So you can see the poll question has been up, and we would like your input on whether you have the information, and this is for parents, if you have the information that you need to confidently make a decision on your 12 to 17-year-old youth around getting the COVID-19 vaccine. If we can have your responses to this poll question. Okay, so here are the results. So we've got 34% feeling that they do have the information needed, 28% being that they don't, and we've got an unsure category of close to 40%. Now, the second question, how hesitant are you in your decision about your 12 to 17-year-old getting a COVID-19 vaccine? Is it very hesitant, somewhat hesitant, and not at all hesitant? And let's see what the responses indicate. Hesitant, we've got 21%, somewhat hesitant, 48%, and not at all, 31%. Terrific. Well, thank you for helping us frame the current situation here with what's on your minds. Now I'd like to introduce our 3 experts, and I'd invite our panelists to turn on their webcams. All right. So first off, we have Dr. Megan Bettle from Health Canada. Dr. Bettle has a background as a research in molecular biology and the genetics of disease. Her position currently is the Director General of the COVID-19 Regulatory Response Team for the Health Products and Food Branch. Welcome, Dr. Bettle. Next, we have Dr. Chagla, who is a specialist in infectious disease and is a consultant physician at the St. Joseph's Hospital and Hamilton Health Sciences in Ontario. He's also an associate professor of medicine at McMaster University. Now, you may have heard from Dr. Chagla or read about him in the media, as he is a sought-after infectious disease expert to provide his perspectives on COVID-19. Welcome, Dr. Chagla. And lastly, we're fortunate to have Dr. Julia Upton. Dr. Upton is on the staff at the Hospital for Sick Children in the Immunology and Allergy Department. She's an associate professor for the Department of Pediatrics at U of T and also the past chair of the Anaphylaxis and Food Allergy section for the Canadian Society of Allergy and Clinical Immunology. She is also the co-author of the CSACI statement on allergy management regarding the COVID-19 vaccine. So welcome to our panelists and thank you for joining us. Now, with the submitted questions that we've got, from the audience, from our listening audience today. Thank you for that, for providing those. We're going to cover off 4 key topics. We're going to first focus on vaccines approved for youth, their safety and efficacy in general. We're then going to move into focused questions on the safety of the vaccine if you're managing an allergy. We're then going to dive a little bit deeper into the side effects of the vaccine specific to youth. And then we're going to end off the session with a discussion on under 12 and back to school perspectives. But to begin with, we'd like to start with addressing the most dominant question from the audience, from the questions submitted right off the top. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Upton, our allergy expert, and this is the question from the viewing audience. If I have a child over the age of 12 with a food allergy, are they eligible to receive a COVID-19 vaccine, and is it safe for them? Dr. Upton?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. Yes, absolutely. Children with food allergy are eligible for the COVID-19 vaccine. And in fact, the recommendation is that they don't need any specialized assessment or pre-testing, and that they can get it in a routine setting and wait for at least 15 minutes after the vaccine, you know, just like everyone else. So that's great.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Dr. Upton. So let's move into what vaccines are approved for youth. Dr. Bettle, I'm going to turn to you. Walk us through what's the role of Health Canada when it comes to the approval of the vaccines, and can you speak to us about which vaccines are currently approved for youth?
Sure. So, I mean, there are many different organizations involved in bringing vaccines to Canadians. So, Health Canada is the first decision maker. So, we are the regulator of all health products in Canada. That means for anything to be sold, to be made available in Canada, manufacturer has to bring all of their data to us, all of their information. They make a submission. So, under the regulations, under the law, Health Canada looks at the safety, the efficacy, and the quality of every product that's going to be approved. So is it safe to use? Does it work for its intended purpose? And is it made well? So is it made well consistently? Can you count on the quality? We take a look at all of that data. We've got large teams looking at that information, and then we can make a decision about benefits and risks. So every product has some side effects. Those are the risks, and looking at the benefits and whatever risks, whatever we know about the safety of the product, how can we manage them? How can we make sure people are informed about them, so that people can take products safely? So that's Health Canada's role, is kind of that first decision making. And in the realm of vaccines, there are also a number of other bodies involved. So the National Advisory Committee on Immunization is a federal group of experts that makes recommendations to the provinces for how vaccines should be used. And ultimately, the provinces and territories take all of this information and they decide how vaccines will be rolled out in their jurisdiction. And once the vaccine's authorized, again, Health Canada's role is to continue to monitor the safety of all products while they're being used in Canada and make any adjustments needed as they go along. So with respect to what's authorized for kids, right now there's only one vaccine that's authorized for kids 12 years of age and older, and that's the Pfizer vaccine. And that was authorized a few months ago and has now been rolled out.
Okay, terrific. So in terms of the safety and efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine for the 12 to 17-year-old, is there, can you provide us with a little bit of information exactly what that safety and efficacy profile looks like for that age category?
Sure. So it's very common for products to be approved for adults first before the use is expanded to kids, and that lets us take all of the data that we all have based on use in adults and also look at specific clinical trials for children. So starting with the Pfizer vaccine, obviously that's been in use around the world. It's been now used in tens of millions of adults, if not more, probably hundreds of millions at this point. And then on top of that, we also had a specific clinical trial for the use of the Pfizer vaccine in kids. So that trial was, like many vaccine studies, it was placebo-controlled. There were about 1,100 kids in each arm. So 1,100 or so got the vaccine, and an equivalent number got a placebo. And then you follow the kids in that study to look at who develops COVID-19 when they're kind of out and about in their normal life, and what the safety profile is. So that study, which when we got the first submission of data, had followed kids for a couple of months, showed that while there were no low numbers of children who developed COVID over the course of the study, all of the kids who developed COVID were those who received the placebo. So that's 100% efficacy for if they got the vaccine, those children did not develop COVID during the course of the study. Safety-wise, they were groups of them had kind of daily diaries to fill out and ongoing follow-up. And what we saw about the safety was basically the same as we've seen with adults. They get a sore arm, they may be tired, may have a day or so of feeling a little bit fluey with sore muscles and that sort of thing, but very minor side effects after the vaccination, and short lasting too. So after a day or so, those adverse events went away. So in the clinical trials, there were no cases of anaphylaxis, there were no cases of blood clots or myocarditis in those trials. And it was very similar safety profile to what we've already seen with the adults. The other thing that was examined in that clinical trial was actually looking at antibody levels and comparing the kids, so the 12 to 15-year-olds, with the immune responses seen in young adults. And the immune responses were basically the same and possibly slightly stronger in the younger kids. So all of that just kind of shows that the safety and the efficacy and everything we already knew about the Pfizer vaccine in adults was very, very similar in the younger population as well.
Okay. I'd like to go to Dr. Chagla because I'd like you to lean in on this conversation specific to efficacy around the Delta variant. I mean, that's being talked an awful lot these days. So can you add to this conversation and speak specifically to the Delta variant?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as many of you know, the Delta variant, or the old nomenclature B1617.2, originally derived from India, but realistically it had likely spread around the world by the time it was really identified as a variant of concern. We do know this variant is much more transmissible than the originals and even the B117 or alpha strain, and there is some concern about a bit more immune escape, so reinfection, and potentially less effectiveness of the vaccines. The good news, though, is across multiple data sets, so in the United Kingdom, in Canada and Alberta and Ontario, and even a recent publication in the New England Journal of Medicine in the United States, we really haven't seen a significant drop-off in vaccine efficacy against symptomatic COVID-19. And so we're still talking, the original clinical trials for Pfizer in the 95% range. We're talking in the 88% range with, again, some degree of error in these measurements. So it could be even higher or lower than that. We still see significant protection against symptomatic COVID-19 leading to hospitalization or death. And really the numbers out of the United Kingdom really do show that, in the sense that all of the vaccines are working well. And again, 63% of the people hospitalized with COVID-19 represent the less than 20% of the population that hasn't been vaccinated. And so, the vaccines are working well. There may be a slight more risk of breakthrough cases, so cases that have mild symptoms associated with COVID-19 after vaccination. But for the most part, these vaccines are working incredibly well, and again, preventing not only COVID-19, but severe complications and hospitalization and death with respect to this. There's not really any signal in the data that the vaccines have been completely lost against the Delta variant. And so vaccination is still an incredibly important tool there.
Okay, now specific question around dosage for youth. given variation in age and sizes, is there a different dosage recommendation? Dr. Bettle, do you want to answer that question?
Sure. So what we've authorized and what was used in the clinical trials for Pfizer, and the same with the ongoing data for Moderna, which hasn't yet been authorized in Canada. What's being proposed for this age group and what's been authorized for Pfizer is the same dosing as for the adults. So it's the same dose and the same dose interval, which is 3 weeks, right, based on the clinical trials. We'll talk later about trials in younger children, and in those studies, kind of lower doses are being tested.
Okay, great. So let's move on to recommendations specific to those managing allergy. So Dr. Upton, when we think about the community that lives with food allergy, what is the guidance from the experts in the field of allergy and the Canadian Society of Allergy and Clinical Immunology? Is the vaccine considered safe for youth with severe food allergies that are at risk for anaphylaxis?
Yes, so for people who have, we consider it an unrelated to the vaccine allergy, and so meaning that someone who has an allergy to food or in the environment or to bee stings or wasp stings, so things that are unrelated to the vaccine itself and the ingredients of the vaccine, and that are not an injectable medication, then the recommendation for people with those types of allergies, food and environmental and venom, are to receive the vaccine routinely without any pre-testing, without any specific pre-evaluation, and to stay in the vaccine center for at least 15 minutes afterwards. And those recommendations hold for all people that are receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. So we know that, if there's going to be an allergic reaction to the vaccine, then it's most likely within those first 15 minutes and certainly within the first 30 minutes. But because the risk for someone with an unrelated allergy is really not clearly any different than someone without any allergies, the recommendation is for them to be treated the same as the general population. Now, if you speak directly to your physician, some physicians may recommend waiting 30 minutes if you'd had a very severe reaction to food, for example. This is it's a reasonable thing to do, and the way that Health Canada writes how to manage people with food allergy, and the way that the Canadian Society of Allergy and Clinical Immunology wrote it also is at least 15 minutes. And so it's not unreasonable to wait a little bit longer if you or your physician do feel that would provide some reassurance. And the key parts are that we don't need to be doing pre-testing. We don't need any delay. We don't want a process that creates anything that would hinder your ability to get that vaccine. That's really what we want. We want people to get the vaccine and not feel significantly different than the rest of the population, because really it's not coming out as a significant risk factor for allergic reaction.
Okay, now, and I just want to go back again on this, because I know that it's like when you say food allergy, we're talking if you have a peanut allergy, if you have a tree nut allergy, if you have a shellfish allergy, if you have a milk allergy, if you have any food allergy, that doesn't stop you from getting the vaccine. Correct? It's like people sometimes want to hear that, yes, it's my allergen. Okay.
It's really important to mention that specifically, because I do know that sometimes people feel like allergists are only talking about peanut or nuts, but you're absolutely correct. Any kind of food allergy, any kind of environmental allergy, all of those, you can get the vaccine. Don't wait. There's no delay. There's no need for a particular assessment or testing prior. You can get it at a vaccine center and wait at least 15 minutes afterwards.
Okay. And also, if you've got, because it's not uncommon for our audience who has food allergy, but they also have eczema and they also have asthma. So it's not just one thing, but when you put all of those things together, does that change the eligibility?
No, so the eligibility, those from an allergic point of view, those are, they're not contraindications to the vaccine.
Okay, well, let's go on to, because if it's, you know, the comment about authorized COVID-19 vaccines should not be routinely offered if a person is allergic to a component. Let's go to the component question, then go to the ingredient question. Let's just walk people through quickly the actual ingredients so people have a view for that, that guidance. Julia, do you want to do a quick, or Dr. Upton, a quick view on kind of the polyethylene glycol and what sort of products those are in and how people would know if they actually had an allergy to those things?
Yeah, so those and thank you for highlighting them red. It's easier to see. So the polyethylene glycol is a component that allows products that can't dissolve into liquid to be able to be in a liquid form. And so it can be found in liquid medications as well as, of course, the vaccine. This is the only, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are the only vaccines that have that are on the market that have polyethylene glycol. So, you know, we often get questions about what if I've had a reaction to a prior vaccine? Could that have been polyethylene glycol? So there are no, I'll say civilian vaccines, because there are sometimes special vaccines that have been used in the military, but there have been no civilian vaccines that have had polyethylene glycol in them. So that would not be the cause of that reaction. And I mean, polyethylene glycol allergy is rare, and you know, it would typically be suspected when somebody is reacting to multiple different seemingly unrelated products, and then a really careful review of the ingredients realizes that there's this common thread. But really, it's very, very rare. And so, you know, if you do have a history where you are reacting to multiply unrelated products, then that would be something to consider, you know, figuring out with your allergist, could it be that? But honestly, it's extraordinarily rare. And so it would be unlikely that there would be many people that are allergic to PEG. Polysorbate 80 has been used in prior vaccines. It has been used in influenza vaccines. And so that could be something that somebody has been exposed to in the past.
I think we heard about the PEG allergy and how it's incredibly rare, and a lot of people are exposed to PEG in, you know, in cosmetic products and even over-the-counter products. And then trimethoprim, which is the Moderna vaccine, which may be of some interest, as this may be the next approved youth vaccine, is a rare allergy that's often seen with things like intravenous contrast or a select number of intravenous antibiotics, but again is an incredibly rare allergy. And I think the third thing just to highlight here is, you know, as much as people are very afraid of these being very new vaccines and having a lot of unknown ingredients, you can actually see there's very, very few ingredients here, right? You know, you have the mRNA component, which is the instruction. You have the fat component, which essentially just stabilizes the mRNA. And then you just have a bunch of salts and sugars basically to stabilize the compound. So, you know, many of these vaccines are literally 8 to 10 ingredients. And so realistically, again, they're not that complex in terms of what they contain. They're relatively simple in terms of their components.
The Government of Canada websites has got a really good document that has been published. And then we will send out with this webinar recording a link to that.
While we're on that, I just wanted to just highlight that, you know, we already spoke about food allergy, environmental allergy, venom allergy. Those, please get the vaccine, you know, as your non-allergic friend does as well. The Health Canada does have advice that they've posted on their website just about recognizing that someone who reacted to an injectable treatment is treated just slightly differently. So if somebody, you know, as Dr. Chagla mentioned, some of those similar components or polysorbate 80 itself can be in, you know, injectable medications. And so there is the advice that if you've reacted to an injectable medication and that it wasn't clearly a component of the vaccine you're going to receive, that you, again, don't need any pre-evaluation, don't need any testing, but here we are recommending that you wait at least 30 minutes. And so the takeaway for that is, if you reacted to an injectable medication and it's not clearly related to the COVID vaccine that you're getting, wait at least 30 minutes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dr. Upton. So I have heard from our technical backend. We will show that link at the end. So a question that did come in, though, is around the likelihood of a child having an allergic reaction to the COVID-19 vaccine if their parent had an allergic reaction to the vaccine. Dr. Upton, can you provide some perspective on that?
Yes, thank you. So in general, the allergy is not familial quite in that way, and so we wouldn't recommend any differences in evaluation, any differences in where they get the vaccine, any pre-testing, or any change in the amount of time that you would wait afterwards for a family history of allergy.
Okay, great. Okay, let's move on to getting more into the side effects for youth. Okay, so Dr. Chagla, can you walk us through the typical side effects for the COVID-19 vaccine experienced by the 12 to 17-year-old age category, and if there's a difference between first and second dose?
Yeah, as Dr. Bettle had mentioned, much of the side effect profile of these vaccines is fairly similar to the adult side effect profile. So, the most common side effect in injection site sore arm often lasts for a day or two. A small percentage of patients develop more systemic symptoms. And again, those are immune symptoms. They're signs of the immune system kind of waking up to the vaccine. So they're not considered dangerous, but they're of uncomfortable for a day or two as they go through. And that's muscle aches, fatigue, a low-grade fever, chills, often lasting 48 hours or less, and usually just resolving with time alone. The second dose, as we know, because your immune system is already primed and you're now seeing a second kind of response, the side effect profile, people getting those immune activating side effects tend to be a little bit higher on that second dose than the first dose. Some people can go through the first dose, feel fine, second dose, feel a bit lousy for a day or two. But again, they're generally self-resolving. They come down with time, and just taking it easy for a day or two often is enough to settle them down. And then the other, obviously concern that's been put out there that is exceptionally rare, but is one thing to be watched for in young individuals, is myocarditis. And this is the cardiac complication that has been associated with vaccinations, particularly males, and particularly on the second dose, although there have been females in first doses described. This is about 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 10,000, depending on the data sets we look at from the CDC. And these generally present as chest pain or shortness of breath within the first few days after the vaccine. When these children are seen in hospital, they do often have signs of cardiac inflammation. They are often just managed in hospital for observation rather than any intensive reason, and are discharged relatively quickly. It is a relatively benign outcome in the sense that even imaging studies of the heart after these events show normal heart function, and there's no adverse consequences of this. Just to put it in the grand context, we think the rate of myocarditis associated with COVID-19 infection is about 6 times higher than the vaccine. So, even in that context, we see these complications associated with the disease itself. And so, it is rare, it needs to be watched, particularly people who are having chest pain should go for a clinical assessment. But most of them still do very well. And again, the vast majority have no long-term complication associated with this.
Okay. Okay, now in terms of some of the adverse events that are being tracked, Dr. Bettle, can you talk to us about how that, because it seems like the information, it's fluid, new things are happening. So how does that go back and get tracked by Health Canada, and what's done with that information?
Yeah, so obviously we've never seen a vaccine rollout like this before. So it's happened very quickly, it's happened globally, and we're learning all the time, because for any product, you can only study so many people in a clinical trial, and you continue to learn. But we have really good processes in place for doing just that, and these have been enhanced incredibly for this particular situation. So with respect to vaccines, there are kind of two main flows of information. So on the public health side, any healthcare professional who learns about a vaccine adverse reaction is required by almost all of the provinces to report that information. So information about side effects should go to your healthcare professional, then reports into the public health agency. At the same time, Health Canada, as the regulator of the manufacturers, any safety data that the drug manufacturers have also has to be reported to us. And we've required the manufacturers to come back to us monthly with a complete update of everything they know about the safety of their product globally and analyzed for specific groups. So for vulnerable populations like kids, like pregnant women, and for specific types of adverse events. So all of that data, we work very closely with the public health agency, with the provinces, and when we see unusual reports, we have teams of medical and scientific specialists who will look at that data, look at everything we know about the vaccines, about the timing of the reaction, and try to figure out if a report is really something that can be plausibly linked to the vaccine. And all of this information comes together, and it kind of informs our recommendations for the product, right? So with the myocarditis, what's really important is that people know that this is a possibility, what to look out for, so that they can get appropriate treatment. So we want to make sure that if there's anything new, that we're disseminating that information, that we're figuring out how to manage a risk, and that we're monitoring it constantly to make sure that we know who's most at risk and if the profile is changing. So we also work very closely with all of the regulators around the world to share that data. We literally have people talking every day to make sure that we know if anything's changing, so that we can take action to make sure that the products can be used safely. Okay. So a huge amount of scrutiny on the safety of the products, and that will continue as long as they're being used.
Okay, terrific. Okay, Dr. Upton, the next question to you around if someone has had an allergic reaction or a bad reaction to the first dose, how should they be thinking about the second dose?
Great, thank you for asking that. So far I've talked about the situations where we are not recommending any particular evaluation, and we are not recommending any particular testing. So those were those situations about having food allergy or environmental allergy or venom allergy. And then the situation where we're recommending a slightly longer than usual wait time at the vaccine clinic, 30 minutes, at least 30 minutes. And that's for people that have had a reaction to an injectable medication that isn't clearly related to the COVID-19 vaccines. So the question you're asking now is the situation where we recommend that it is not routine administration. So you do need an evaluation for a reaction to the first dose. So an allergic reaction, actually severe allergic reaction or anaphylaxis to the first dose, there you cannot get the second dose routinely. And there we would recommend that you are evaluated by a physician to first understand the reaction, because it really, when it's actually not as easy as you might think to know the difference between an allergic reaction after the vaccine or all the many other things that can happen after the vaccine. When people go for this vaccine, they can be quite emotional. You know, we're all coming off 18 months of one of the strangest times in our lives. And, you know, any of us that have been to the vaccine centers, you see the emotion that's there. People can get flushing reactions, people can faint. It can really be quite overwhelming for people. And that's on top of the usual needle fears and the usual, you know, just being in an unusual environment that goes along with going to these vaccine centers. So, you know, in terms of thinking about what happened to the person after the vaccine, first and foremost, we need to understand, you know, what was the type of reaction, because a fainting reaction or some flushing, those would not be you know, considered an allergic reaction to the vaccine. But if there was an allergic reaction to the vaccine, especially anaphylaxis, so by this I mean that someone had generalized hives, wheezing, swelling, breathing problems, vomiting, diarrhea, low blood pressure, those types of reactions, if it's considered a severe allergic reaction or anaphylaxis, then they need to be evaluated by an allergist prior to receiving the vaccine, or evaluated by a physician prior to receiving the next vaccine. Because some of the options that will be discussed and considered is, firstly, is there an alternative vaccine that doesn't contain some of the components? So for an adult, for example, there may be an option to use a different style of vaccine. For kids, as was mentioned, right now only the Pfizer vaccine is available, so using a different style of vaccine wouldn't be an option. And then it becomes what we often talk about in medicine as a shared decision making, a discussion about the risk of receiving the vaccine and the benefit. And I will say that many people really, really want to receive that second dose. They want to have that immunity. We know from the studies that the second dose appears to give longer lasting, better immunity. And so there are ways that an allergist can discuss immunizing in a more medicalized setting, perhaps using a different approach. It's a somewhat individualized decision, but there are ways that an allergist can discuss in a risk-benefit type scenario how to get that shot. And I will say that there is a very recent publication of close to 200 people from the US that were evaluated for a first dose allergic reaction. Almost all of them received the second dose, and they didn't react with anything more than most had no reaction, and a few had very minor reaction. So we really don't seem to have a consistent, many of the people that had a reaction to the first dose will tolerate the second dose, but it really needs to be treated in a very different way and considered in a very different way than all of the other allergic situations I've discussed.
Okay, so it could be a bad reaction, but you have to understand, is it an allergic reaction or not? And it could look very different between first and second dose. Okay, great.
Absolutely.
Let's move on to long-term side effects, because there were some, there is concern around the potential long-term side effects of COVID-19 vaccines on youth, given their developing body. So we received a number of questions around this. And Dr. Chagla, I'm going to turn to you first. And the actual participant question in this case was, help us understand the risk-benefit analysis for kids, given that if they get COVID, it tends to be lighter symptoms. And there's this, view that there may be a lack of data about the long-term health effects on their health and their fertility. So can we turn to you, Dr. Chagla, for that discussion on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say a couple of things. One, vaccines are unique in the sense that they're very short-acting medications. And I think that principle has always been there for many of our other vaccines. There isn't a real long-term side effect profile associated with them. And it's because biologically, the way they're programmed to work is to have a rapid but brief response, often in the deltoid muscle where things are injected, and in the surrounding immune tissue. And then basically the vaccine degrades and your body does the rest of the work at that point, right? And so we've looked for many of these side effects with vaccines. They often are within the first 4 weeks after vaccination, and we really don't see anything long-term. And the other piece of this is, these vaccines work, particularly Moderna and Pfizer, by using mRNA, which is the instructions on how to make a protein, in order to make that protein, which then triggers an immune response. When someone gets infected with COVID-19, the virus going throughout the entire body makes millions and millions of times more copies of mRNA encoding the spike protein in like the top to bottom of the body cells. And so if we were to see long-term effects with COVID-19 for fertility, for a side effect profile in that population, they would be a million times worse in people that had COVID-19 as compared to having the vaccine. As essentially, again, the virus is like having, you know, a million doses of vaccine all at once as the virus is replicating. So again, you know, I think there certainly is the need for monitoring long term, and as part of Health Canada's duty and as part of the clinical trials that are being followed, that we forget about, that register these drugs are still being followed for long term. But again, the overwhelming concern of what's going to happen in 6 months or a year, you know, if we would have seen something, people make a normal recovery from COVID-19, the vaccine is far less likely to have a long-term side effect than the actual disease itself.
Okay, thank you. So, Dr. Bettle, with the Health Canada viewpoint, what does Health Canada factor in when they think about long-term side effects?
So I think Dr. Chagla covered it all very well, right? So we start from kind of principles of immunology. What do we know about how vaccines work and what the body is exposed to, and just kind of a very long history of how immune responses are characterized. So even if kind of how the mRNA vaccines are delivering the protein is slightly different from what we've used before, the same principles are there. And these types of products have actually been studied for a very long time. It's just this is the first time that mRNA vaccines have been brought to market. So we actually know a lot about the science of the vaccines. Each product is analyzed, kind of assessed individually. So we look at, you know, not just the clinical trials, we look at all of the animal data. There's been kind of full toxicology studies and reproductive toxicology studies for the vaccines, and there have been no issues detected there. And then you look at the clinical trials and following people. So even in the phase 3 clinical trials where participants were actually supposed to use very effective birth control, there were pregnancies, and those have been followed up and completed, and there have been no kind of fertility issues identified there. So, I mean, as I mentioned, just kind of as a general rule, we look and we follow the safety, especially for vulnerable populations. We look at pregnancy, we look at breastfeeding, we look at the products for as long as they're being used, and we'll continue to follow them. But I would say there's been often a myth that you need a certain number of years of follow-up to understand the safety profile of a product. Which is maybe the case for things that you take every day for years and years. That, you know, biologically that makes sense. There may be long-term effects. Again, very short exposure of the vaccine, and they've been now used in millions and millions and millions of people. So where we are seeing any adverse events, we're now picking up only those which are very, very rare that you can get from those vast populations exposure. So, I mean, again, it's always looking at the population, looking at the risk and benefit, and making a decision every time, but also ensuring that the surveillance is ongoing and that we can take any measures needed. So I think we're very confident in the safety profile of these products.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay, now before we go on to the conversation for the under 12, I just have a couple of questions for Dr. Upton that I want to handle before we move on to that. And because we did get some questions on this. Penicillin allergy, is it a contraindication? Can you safely take the COVID-19 vaccine if you have a penicillin allergy?
So how it's been separated, you know, I think really largely to be able to have a clear message is that if you reacted to an injectable or you know, IV or injectable medication that's unrelated to the COVID-19 vaccine, then you don't need any evaluation, you don't need any testing prior, but you would wait for 30 minutes. If on the other hand, it was, you know, your history is that you reacted to oral penicillin, then you'd really be in the category more of a completely unrelated allergy to a non-injectable medication. Now, that may be a little arbitrary, but I mean, that's it. Just what we're trying, what Health Canada and other organizations are trying to do is just make that distinction between an injectable or intravenous medication, because the medications are in solution in those products. So, so it's either, you know, no testing, no evaluation prior, and either wait, at least 15 minutes or at least 30 minutes, depending on whether that person's reaction was to oral or to injectable.
Okay, one other, if you're undergoing oral immunotherapy, is there any reason that you should wait on getting the COVID-19 vaccine?
So that's a great question. So, I'll take one tiny step back to say that one of the pieces of advice that, is given around the COVID-19 vaccine and really around most vaccines is that if you have an illness currently, that you wait until you're well to get the vaccine, for the simple reason that we don't want to confuse the existing illness with any potential effect of the vaccine. And so really just from a kind of a common sense, making life easier for both you and your doctor to figure out if there was any kind of side effect, we often recommend that people get things when they're well. So when we sort of take that logic and apply it to oral immunotherapy, you can imagine that if you took your COVID-19 vaccine and then that day you also increased your dose of your oral immunotherapy, or you took some other treatment or new medication or some kind of other potential thing that you could react to, then it may confuse things and it will be very difficult to know what was what and what happened. The other thing is that the COVID-19 vaccine, as with many other vaccines, can induce a fever and being a bit unwell. So what many allergists are recommending is to just don't confuse the issue, make life easy, just hold off on the updose, and I would leave that to the particulars of your physician. If usually people that are doing oral immunotherapy have quite good access to their physician, because there's no exact right or wrong way to do it. It's really about reducing the risk of confusion and reducing the risk of a reaction that really could be prevented. We wouldn't want you to have the COVID-19 vaccine, get a fever, take that dose of milk or peanut or whatever and have a reaction when we could have just waited a day or two, So it's really a common sense approach as opposed to a particular overriding medical issue, if that makes sense.
Great. Okay, thank you. We need to move on to the under 12 because a lot in our audience are interested in under 12, what the outlook is for a vaccine for the under 12, but also the question of, do we need a vaccine for under 12 when we talk about herd immunity? I'm going to first go to Dr. Chagla and then over to you, Dr. Bettle. Can you talk to us about how is COVID-19 currently viewed for the under 12 and what's your view on kind of the necessity of having a vaccine in place for that group?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've learned a lot, obviously, through the pandemic and what the role of children are in the pandemic. And we absolutely, children can get COVID-19. I think that's definitely never been something that's been ignored. The vast majority of children do well with COVID-19, but there are complications of children requiring hospitalization for respiratory support. We've heard about this inflammatory syndrome of MIS-C and MIS-A in adults, which can be a complication of COVID-19 or the aberrant immune response to COVID-19. And we've certainly talked a little bit about long-term symptoms with COVID-19. And so, I think, children obviously need to be in environments where they're with other children, where there's a risk of transmission, and having a large unvaccinated group with fairly predominant variants circulating around the world is not going to necessarily mean that they can be completely out of the loop in terms of vaccines long term. And so, certainly there's a lot of progress here. The outlook really does favor that these trials will likely find some success in these age groups, and whether or not the right dose or the right side effect profile is there to approve it. But yeah, certainly I think we do see children as a target for therapy and for vaccinations. There is a burden there that's significant, not only to the individual children, but to society at large from them too. And knowing that they can also amplify and transmit within society is important for us to get more control within our communities.
Right. Okay. Dr. Bettle, so over to you at Health Canada. I mean, you're in the front line of the approval process. Where are we at for the under 12?
So I think, as I mentioned before, so we've got the 12s and above for Pfizer. We're currently reviewing 12 and above for Moderna. We do not yet have data submitted to us for younger age groups. Those studies are ongoing. All of the manufacturers of authorized vaccines are now doing studies in children, again with a range of doses, because the smaller children don't need the full adult dose, and just trying to figure out what's the most effective dose with the best safety profile. So from what's been released in the media, we can expect some of that data, perhaps for the 5 to 12-year-olds, to begin to be available in early fall. But we'll see. We'll see how the studies go and see what data comes out of it. It's kind of hard to tell when we might actually expect to see those submissions. But like all of our normal processes, we would wait till the data is available, have that data come into us, do our own assessment of the safety and the efficacy, and then make a decision about whether it could be authorized. So fingers crossed that we can have some information at least on the efficacy in the younger age group soon, within the next couple of months. Probably not before everyone has to go back to school though.
Well, and to that end, and I'm going to go back to you, Dr. Chagla, on this. So we've got this complicated picture of, well, we're doing well as a vaccine rollout. There's still more uptake required. We've got Delta variant, and now we don't have an option imminently before back to school for the under 12. So the question on some people's mind is like, is it safe to go back to school, and safe for the students? Is it safe for the unvaccinated youth and for their vaccinated parents? Talk to us about kind of what your views are on back to school.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've learned a lot in the last year in terms of how to, function in school safely. We've had places like British Columbia and Alberta that have been able to really maintain a full school year. We're clearly not going to go back to school like pre-2019 levels, and there is going to need to be a significant amount of control and mitigation done in schools to prevent COVID from transmitting, to limit kind of the spread within the community around, and to really make sure children are safe in school and can have as many in-class days as possible and as close to a normal school year as possible. So, I think the prognosis is obviously good for schools. The best thing parents can do is immunize everyone within their households appropriately. So siblings that are over the age of 12 to get them vaccinated. If they are not vaccinated, to get themselves as parents vaccinated, because, again, much of school transmission starts in the household and then trickles into school. And so creating a shield in the household really does mitigate that risk altogether. And be prepared and flexible that things like masking, things like class sizes, things like more outdoor and indoor activity may change throughout the year as time goes on. But I think there is a pathway for having schools as functioning and in class, and definitely is much safer from a community standpoint as compared to a year ago, even with a more transmissible variant. But certainly vaccinations are a great step for parents to make sure that they are ready for school individually, or again for 12-year-olds or their siblings.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, I see now that we're almost out of time, and so I'd like to thank our panelists. We really appreciate, I know that you're all very busy, but we appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with our audience. I do want to tell you a little bit about what's happening next. We've got obviously the webinar or the survey that we'd like you to complete. We do have on our website that gets updated the COVID-19 information and food allergy section on our website. We referenced earlier a little bit of information about the vaccine ingredient. If you're looking for more information on that, you can see that is the link that you can get to the Canada website on that, the Government of Canada website. But again, we're going to send that link to you with the recording that's going to come out in a few days. We have some really good webinars planned for back to school on August 12th. We've got Kyle Dine, who's doing a webinar specifically targeted for youth about what it's like to go back to middle school and high school if you've got a food allergy. On August 24th, for parents, We're delighted to have Dr. Rebecca Knibb join us. She is from Ashton University in Birmingham, UK, and she's a researcher and practitioner of psychology with over 25 years of experience in conducting research into the psychological impacts of allergies. So really would encourage you to sign up for that. On September 28th, we're delighted to have Dr. Philippe Bégin to speak to our audience about understanding the severity of your food allergy. He's with the University of Montreal and a clinician research in allergy and a real leading expert in multi-allergen OIT as the director of St. Justine's OIT Clinic in Montreal. So as a reminder, you'll get a short survey through GoToWebinar. Immediately after this, it'll pop up on your screen. Please take a moment to fill it out. You'll also get that survey in an email in the next hour. We really treasure your feedback. It helps us to inform your information needs. And lastly, I'd like to thank our supporters. As you know, we are a charity and we're reliant on the generosity of communities and organizations to offer free programming such as this. If you enjoyed the webinar, please consider a donation to Food Allergy Canada. We would also like to thank the individual donors who have provided contributions to this actual webinar on our donation drive for extending the reach of vaccine information and programming. We'd also like to thank the contribution that we received from the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada and to the supporters of our ongoing webinar series, the Walter and Marita Schroeder Foundation, the Sean Delaney Memorial Golf Classic, EpiPen, and the Peanut Bureau of Canada. Thank you to everyone for your participation today. As a reminder, you will receive the recording. In the coming days, we will email it to you. This now concludes our webinar.